Alright guys, after class today it seemed like some of you wanted some more ideas as to how you're going to be able to stretch out the actual writing in your assignment. So whereas you're probably used to writing the 5 paragraph essay, this is going to be 4 to 5 pages talking about one rhetorical device, or 4 to 5 pages talking about ethos, pathos, or logos, depending on how you're setting up your paper. So I'm going to run through the prompt just real quick again and show you 2 examples of papers from students from last year that might give you an idea as to how you can stretch those things out. So you'll see once again that you're writing in rhetorical analysis comparing two This I Believe essays. Your 4 to 5 page analysis will examine the ways these authors use specific persuasive strategies to speak to an audience, and you will use close reading of the text and evidence in the form of quotes to support your reading. So we're not looking at what the author says, but we're looking at how the author says and what sort of an impact that has on the audience who's reading it, and who in the end is more effective, which of the two authors. So let's look at this first example from a student last year who was using direct quotations as their rhetorical strategy. If we read through the introduction, you'll see that they kind of discuss what a direct quotation is and move into their thesis statement. So they say the rhetorical device direct quotation is a citation of the precise words used in a speech, essay, or dialogue. A direct quotation holds significance because it stands out and ties everything within a narrative together. With the use of a direct quotation, an author is capable of giving their message to their readers sufficiently. The specific words used in the direct quotation are important to the entire narrative. So you'll notice that right here they start to bring up that level of specificity that we were talking about in class, that we're going to need to be very detail oriented in what we're talking about. They also say several authors from This I Believe insert direct quotations to add detail to their essay. In a narrative, the use of direct quotation is important because it clarifies the author's emotion and helps the author project their idea to their readers more clearly. So this is their thesis statement. When y'all are writing your thesis statements, you're going to want to include that compare and contrast element to your thesis. So, you know, who was more effective and why? That will be the big question that you'll want to discuss in your thesis statement, okay? So if we look at their first example, we're not going to go through the whole essay, but we're going to look at her first example paragraph, where she's using a specific narrative and talking about the rhetorical strategy, which is direct quotation. So she says, in Steve Benko's A Silent Night That Brought On Healing, Benko discusses how the magic of Christmas music heals him mentally. After Benko is placed in a military hospital with a shattered leg, he encounters a man far more injured than himself. So right here, we have what I would kind of say is setting the stage, where she's summarizing and giving the essential information. That means when I'm reading this, or any person is reading the essay, we know exactly what's happening in the story. We know the essential gist of what's going on in that narrative. So the rest of what she's going to say when she's talking about the direct quotations and why they're effective is going to be clearer, and we can understand whether or not those are effective based on this knowledge that we have right here. She goes on to say, Benko clarifies his message when he quotes the song Silent Night with all is calm, all is bright. Without direct quotation from this particular Christmas song, Benko would not be capable of sending the correct message to his readers. With the use of this quote, it is understood that despite Benko's injuries, Christmas music pulls him out of his pain mentally and puts him at ease. So here is her first little claim that she has. Oh, whoops. Her first claim, which is saying why this is important. So make sure that you include that. She does it at the beginning of her paragraph before she even goes into her examples. If Benko decided to use a different Christmas song to quote, such as Winter Wonderland or Jingle Bells, he would not have been able to send the same message to the reader that Silent Night does. So kind of what we were talking about earlier, that level of specificity, what would have happened if it was different? what would have happened if they used a different song? If we were talking about metaphors, for example, what would have happened if it was a simile? What would have happened if it was an illusion? Why did they choose those two things? If he did use one of those songs, he would have given the impression that he was overjoyed during this time. Silent Night effectively shows Banquo's calm and collected emotions despite his major injury during a war. That being said, Banquo's direct quotation allows him to send his message to his readers more clearly. With an understanding of his emotions, he effectively shows his readers the magic of Christmas music makes his situation tolerable and easy. Banquo's use of direct quotation also holds significance because there is a lack of dialogue throughout his narrative. This allows the quote that he chooses to stand out among the rest of his narrative. The quote he chooses also helps make a connection between the flashback he uses and his belief in himself. So the only thing that I would say in this paragraph is that she hasn't actually used textual evidence. So what she has done here is she's made several really good claims, but as she continues, she needs to back it up with the evidence. And we're going to look at an example of that right now. This student, Alejandro, is looking at the use of the word God and how it's repeated throughout the text. A couple of these authors are successful in the ways they use God to make a convincing narrative. However, there are also instances where they show weaknesses in their central ideas. Nonetheless, this strategy would play as an important role to the significance of each of their texts. So let's look at an example in his paragraph where he's actually using quotations to prove his point. So to start the paragraph off, he says, in the narrative, Finding the Strength to Fight Our Fears, Terry Awal writes about his experience in Israel when he was 11 years old. Awal experiences fear attempting to cross to get his grandmother's house when he thinks the soldiers are going to shoot him on the way to his destination. Through the process, Awal overcomes a feeling in which he is connected to God. Immediately, he feels less fear due to the fact that he starts remembering the words of his mother, in which are to feel bad for the soldiers because they are just as scared as he is. So once again, we have this summary and essential information provided so that when he starts to discuss the actual examples, we know what he's talking about. We have some contextual information to base this off of. He continues by saying, ultimately, Awal thanks God for helping him overcome fear and get past the struggle of understanding that we are all human beings, and as human beings, we experience the same emotions. The first instance in which Awal implements the use of the word God is when he states, to calm myself, I started begging God to take mercy on me and save me from these men and their guns. So here we go. Here is an example of using the quotation. First off, we have this introduction to the quote. He's not just saying, Awal says. Instead, he has an entire sentence leading up to it, and it ties in to what he's already been discussing. Then we have the actual quote itself. And let's read on to see what we have next. He says, in the sentence, Awal uses God to initiate the reason for him to calm down. So this is an explanation of the actual sentence, just like we had discussed in class. So why is this important? He says this is important because the term is used as a turning point in Awal's narrative. While the beginning of the text states the danger and fear Awal is experiencing because of the armed soldiers, the first sentence he uses the word God, the tone completely changes to a more tranquil and subtle tone. So here he's saying, why is this important? His answer to that is the first time that this author uses the word God in the repetitive sense, it changes tone and marks a change in the actual text. He continues by saying that this change in tone gives power to God through the rest of his narrative, for it states the reason for his tranquility and power over fear. So if you look at just this first example, he has 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences just to explain this first example. And I think he does a really good job of explaining it. And if you look a little bit beforehand, he had 4 or 5 sentences summarizing what had been happening in the story. He continues on to give another example to prove his point, another 4 or 5 sentences, and then he kind of follows it up with a conclusion at the end. He says, this concept of using God to soothe tension gives his text a clear reason as to what made him the person in which he is today. Not only did God help him fight through rough times as he was an adolescent, but by stating current events that endured fear to many people, such as 9/11, AWOL clearly points out how God is still the center of what makes him fight fear through all odds. So at the end of his paragraph, he concludes it with kind of an answer to so what? Why does any of this matter? Okay, so that would be what it looks like to utilize the actual examples in your text. But you just want to remember that what these students have done, and I will post these examples online, the prompt is a little bit different for them, but what these students have done is they've been looking at the actual word-to-word differences in the examples that they're discussing and in the rhetorical strategies. They're looking at, why any of this matters, what change happens in the text, etc. So keep those things in mind as you start drafting this week and preparing yourself for conferences.